G'day everyone, I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and welcome to this week's webinar, How Australia Created a Housing Crisis and What We Can Do to Fix It. As you might hear, I don't sound too well. I'm working from home today. I've had a bit of a cold, so you'll have to bear with me. I've got a bit of a cough and a few other things. Hopefully it won't annoy everyone. But I'm really excited about today's webinar. We've had over 1,200 people register, so huge interest in today's topic. Thank you all so much for joining us. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I live and work on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country and pay my respects to elders past and present. A reminder that you can find all of our webinars on the Australia Institute website, australiainstitute.org.au. And we've always got upcoming webinars, but days and times too vary. So please head on over to our website to check that out. A couple of Zoom tips before we get going to make sure this all runs smoothly. You can type in questions for our panelists using the Q&A box. You should be able to upvote other people's good questions and leave comments on them as well. A reminder to please keep things civil and on topic in the chat, or we'll boot you out. And finally, this is our live event and it is being recorded. It will go up on our YouTube channel and the Australia Institute event page for this event later today, and you can find it there. But today we're going to be talking about Australia's housing crisis, which is acute at the moment. Over recent years, rents have absolutely soared. According to Anglicare's 2024 rental affordability snapshot, just 0.6% of rentals across the country were affordable for a person earning a full-time minimum wage. For people looking to buy a house to live in, the situation is also grim, with the house price growth outstripping wages for decades. In December of 1990, the average house price was 9 times the average household income. In December last year, it was 16.4 times the average household income. And despite a lot of governments talking about housing affordability, the problem only seems to be getting worse. The situation is dire, but solutions do exist, and that's what we're here to talk about today. And joining me are 3 wonderful guests. Maiy Azize is the national spokesperson for Everybody's Home. That's the national campaign to fix Australia's housing crisis. Jordan Vanderberg, also known as Purple Pingers on social media, is a lawyer and creator of shitrentals.org. And Matt Grudnoff is senior economist at the Australia Institute and my good colleague. Welcome to you all. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Eb.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Maiy, I just wanted to start with you. A lot of the figures I just cited are from Anglicare, but can you tell us about the kind of scope of the problem that Australians are facing when it comes to finding affordable housing today?
I think it almost feels like a cliche to say that it's never been worse, but truly it's never been worse. You talked about that statistics, 0.6% of rentals being affordable for someone on the minimum wage. Since I started, my day job is at Anglicare Australia, and since I've been here in 2017, 0% of rentals have been affordable for someone on the job seeker payment, 0% on youth allowance, 0% on disability support pension, which isn't surprising if you can't afford to rent on a full-time minimum wage. It's not a real shock that you can't afford to rent if you're out of work or struggling in some other way. But the thing that's been really interesting to see and really sad to see is that when I first started, people earning the minimum wage could afford about 10% of rentals. It's now down to less than 1%. So you can see we've had a really big change in just the last decade alone. We've got 10% rent increases coming through just about every single year on average. And if you look at the SQM data, on average asking rents, it's gone up by about 75% since the start of the pandemic, which is epic. I don't know anybody who's had a 75% wage increase. The pension hasn't gone up by 75%, job seeker, DSP, you name it, minimum wage. None of these things are going up by anywhere near the amount that we're seeing rent increases go up by. The Everybody's Home campaign has just been, we're in the middle of doing this People's Commission into the housing crisis, and we had hearings in Sydney where we were talking to people about their experiences, and we just heard real despair from really average people having really average experiences. We heard from people who have had to move with their children every single year for the past decade, take their kids out of school because they're just being consistently priced out of the areas that they live in. Their kids don't even believe them when they say, "Oh, we're not going to move anymore. We found a home." We've had people, talking to us about that in tears. On the other end of the spectrum, for older people, when you're a renter and you're retiring into this rental system on a really fixed income, we heard from people saying literally that they hope their life ends because they can't afford to retire, and they're finding it tough to find rooms in share houses at their age, and being discriminated against by landlords and prospective housemates and things. And we also hear from people who are kind of just grateful to live in the homes they live in. We heard from an international student who migrated to Australia from the Philippines 5 years ago, and he lives in what the Daily Telegraph calls the smallest rental in Sydney. It's 12 square meters, so it's like the size of a car park. And he was just telling us how grateful he is to have somewhere to live. And he also told us a story about how he once had to go 29 days without eating food, just drinking water, because he was, needing to keep paying the rent and works casually and wasn't getting consistent work, and keeps applying for rentals, keeps applying for affordable rentals, new places to try and live, and can't find them. So we've got a system that isn't working for people. I don't like to say the system is broken. I think the system is working exactly the way it was designed to work, which is to work for people who are investing in housing, and casualties in that are people who need homes to live in.
Yeah, thanks, May. That's some really harrowing kind of testimony that you've got through the People's Commission. Just for people following along, where can people find out about that People's Commission?
Yeah, so if you go onto everybody'shome.com.au, we've got a big tab at the top that says People's Commission. We're really happy to have the Australia Institute participate in that and make a submission to that. I suspect you guys might be featured in our final report. But yeah, we're having some more hearings later in the month that are focused on people who are living in regional areas and First Nations communities. We expect that to be pretty harrowing as well, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But yeah, we've just done our face-to-face hearings.
And Jordan, I want to come to you next. You started shitrentals.org. I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about what that is and why you felt the need to start it.
Yeah, good question. Shitrentals.org is just like it's pretty much a Google review, but for your house, or your rental, or your real estate agency. And I started it because I was, making funny little videos on TikTok about making fun of someone's house effectively. And a lot of people were kind of sending in their houses, and I was going over, having a chat to them, and then kind of making fun of it so that something would get done, and we could see some change from that particular landlord, for that particular person's story. But it became too much. Like, there were too many people sending in their homes to be reviewed, and it's also unfair that someone has to go through some white guy on the internet to tell their story. So yeah, that's why the website started. You can review your own rental. You don't have to go through me, and you can, warn other renters, other prospective renters, that, hey, this is what it's actually like to live in this property. Because yeah, when we've got a national vacancy rate of 1%, you're going to have to put up with stuff that you don't like, and they're not going to tell you what that stuff is. So yeah, shitrentals.org is a way to kind of warn people about that. But it's also a way, like, we're using the data from that to, a lot of times when we talk about shit rentals in Australia and like the standard of housing and like landlords and stuff like that, the the response from government and the response from, real estate lobbies is to be like, well, it's just a few bad apples and whatever. And like, that saying doesn't even make sense, because a few bad apples spoil a bunch. That's how the saying works. But people are saying, and like even on the project and stuff, aren't these just outliers and stuff like that? So like, it's a way to collect all this data and show that, hey, this isn't a few outliers. These are thousands and thousands of homes in Australia that are objectively shit, and can result in deaths if we allow this to continue. So yeah, that's the goal behind shitrentals.org.
And what are some of the kinds of things that people have posted to shit rentals that they're either putting up with or were hidden from them when they were moving into a property or renting a property?
Yeah, so like everything from like basic stuff that I assume most of us would have experienced, like, the landlord just rocking up without notice or anything like that, to like some pretty horrific stuff. Like there's some pretty pretty bad stories on there. I don't even know where to start, but like stories of some pretty extreme racism, to migrant families, to like one person found a shotgun in the wall, and the place was broken into and they didn't find the shotgun, but they broke the wall next to where the shotgun was. Like asbestos is a big one. Black mold, and actually all colors of mold, leaky taps, like just I don't yeah, like anything you can imagine. Like we're we're paying for the privilege of renting in Australia. That's yeah, it's great. It's good stuff.
And how much has that grown over time, the interest in shit rentals and, people finding out about it and sharing that kind of information?
Yeah, unfortunately, it has grown over time as the vacancy rate gets lower and lower, and landlords get more and more greedy, because they can see just how much they can profit from, you know, desperate people. Like when you look at the hierarchy of needs, we will sacrifice a lot to have a house that we can live in, and people are sacrificing a lot. People are giving up food, people are giving up medicine, so that they can live. And landlords know this, and this is great for them.
Mm. I can see we've got about 530 people on the line with us. Thank you so much for joining us today. Just a reminder that you can pop questions for the panel into the Q&A box. We'll come to those in a few minutes, and you can also upvote other people's questions and things as well. Matt Grudnoff, I want to come to you next, because obviously this is an issue that governments at the state and federal level talk about trying to solve all the time. We see things like first home buyers grants, but there's a lot of ways in which we can make housing more or less affordable. What are some of the problems that we currently have that are making this problem worse in terms of policies?
Well, I think the biggest problem is most of the government policies that are claimed to try and make housing more affordable actually make housing less affordable. So, first home buyers grants, basically preferencing one group by giving them more money or allowing them to be able to bid up the price even higher, only makes house prices even higher for everybody. And so, there are basically two ways you can make housing more affordable. You can increase supply. So, if the government went out there and, it reversed its, abandonment of public housing, and it decided to actually go out there and build an enormous amount of public housing, that would make housing more affordable. Or it can decrease demand for housing. And that might seem odd at first, but what I mean is there's been this sort of rush in the last 20 years to invest in housing. For people to think of housing as not a good where, you go and you raise a family and you have security, but rather as an investment, something that'll, build your financial nest egg for the future. And that investment, the creation of that investment demand, is actually what's driving house prices higher. May's right that the system is working as intended. So to give you some numbers, 25% of people 25% of people currently, sorry, my screen just went weird. 25% of investment properties are owned by 1% of taxpayers. So we have a position now where there's lots of people rushing in to buy 2, 3, 4, or even 30 odd investment properties, and that's driving up demand. And they've got enormous tax concessions to do this. Things like the capital gains tax discount and negative gearing, those two combined are worth more than $20 billion.
Oh, is that me? Oh, Matt.
I think Matt's died.
Um, if people want to find out more about the Australia Institute's research on that, you can head on over to our website. But basically, what Matt's talking about is the fact that pretty much since we introduced the capital gains tax discount, which I think was around back in 1999, this problem essentially exploded. We've had negative gearing for a long time, but it's that in combination with the capital gains tax discount that really put this problem on steroids. Hopefully Matt can join us again in a little bit, because I'd like to ask him too about some of the other schemes that we've seen, for example, the Coalition's idea to raid your super to pay for a housing deposit, which I think kind of just replicates some of those existing problems that we can see with the first home buyers grant. Maiy, I wanted to come back to you and ask about how we used to do public and social housing and affordable housing, because it doesn't feel like it's always been this way. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I agree with everything Matt's just said, but I think this issue about the government's role in delivering housing and the tax issue together are really two sides of the same coin. So we used to have an era in Australia where housing was really affordable, several decades, right? And after the Second World War, governments in Australia basically built up created the idea of public housing, built it from the ground up. And it used to deliver a lot of housing itself. The government used to build a lot of homes to rent to people. It also used to build homes to sell to people. At the height of public housing in Australia, about 1 in 3 renters rented from the government, and about 1 in 4 new builds was being built by the government, right? And 1 in 3 renters was living in housing provided by the government right up until the early 80s. So this played a really big role, not just in keeping housing affordable for the people who lived in those homes, but actually keeping housing affordable for everybody, because the government just had such a big footprint, and all sorts of people used to live in these homes. So public servants, construction workers, teachers, you name it. Once the government started stepping back from providing housing itself, it became a lot harder for people to get social housing. So now to get social housing, you really have to it's extremely difficult, like just at our People's Commission, we were hearing from people who are on waiting lists of about 10 years, but you basically can't be working, and you've got to have some pretty exceptional circumstances going on in your life, whereas this kind of housing used to be for everybody. So I would say that's the first big thing that the government did to push up the cost of housing in Australia. I totally echo what Matt was saying about tax. I mean, for us, that's really the other side of the coin to our campaign. We're a campaign for more social housing. We're also a campaign for tax reform. We know that when the government introduced the capital gains tax discount, and more people started taking up the negative gearing tax deductions, it really changed who landlords are in Australia. So before that, most landlords of Australia were actually positively geared, which means they owned the house that their renter was living in, and you didn't see these 10% rent increases every single year. What we're seeing now is more and more housing is being delivered by these kind of highly leveraged amateur landlords, and we're seeing them behave in really different ways to what we've seen before, and you really can't explain it any other way besides the tax stuff.
I'm just interested in that description of them as amateur landlords. Maiy, what do you mean by that?
Yeah, I sometimes get a bit of pushback from this language. I will say I never use the phrase mum and dad investors. I never, I think it's kind of manipulative language, actually. I say amateur landlords. I think there's downsides to having institutions and people who own multiple homes providing housing. But there are a lot of upsides as well, because, we know that when people are negatively geared, they're making a loss. They're really sensitive to things like interest rate increases. They're always trying to maximize the amount of money they're making. They're kind of skirting thin. We know a lot of people don't stay. People who own just one investment property often flip their homes after just a couple of years. So, you know, they aren't approaching it as though they're supplying an essential service. I mean, this is another thing I talk about all the time. I'd be really interested in Geordie's perspective on it. You know, your water provider, like your utilities, electricity providers, they can't just arbitrarily raise prices for no reason, and they can't cut you off very easily. It's like double digits in most states. They need to go back and offer you kind of hardship programs if you haven't paid. You know, they're really tightly regulated. But when it comes to the homes that we live in, we just sort of allow these amateur people to become suppliers of something that's an essential service, and provided in this really loose way. I mean, even, you know, the workplaces that we're in, you know, your employers are obliged to make them safe. And if you have an incident at work, WorkSafe would be on site within about half an hour. When it comes to the homes that we live in, you know, it's a shit fight just to get, you know, minimum rental standards like basic insulation. You know, caps on rent increases only exist really in the ACT. And I think this is all driven by the fact that housing is supplied by small time kind of hobby landlords.
You're on mute. Yep.
Sorry, I'm on mute so I don't cough all over you. Sorry, everyone. Geordie, I wanted to come to you next just to respond to Maiy in the first instance. About, I mean, that must be exactly the kind of behavior that you're seeing on ship rentals all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's the comparing it to like energy providers is really interesting because you we had a look, I think it was 2021 or 2022, like gas supplies like artificially reduce the supply of gas, and gas is not a human right. Housing is a human right, and the government was like, hey, that's wrong. We're going to force you to supply more gas, and yeah, you can't, you know, we can step in, we can control the price. We have a bunch of these powers, and we're happy to do that as long as you can still keep getting your gas. But then when it comes to housing, we're like, oh, that's the market. It's you know, it's the market, and it's not the market. It's a bunch of landlords being greedy. But that is, I guess, the market. But yeah, so like we know what has to be done here. We've had every state and federal and local councils had an inquiry into the housing crisis, and it's produced a bunch of recommendations from people that are far smarter than me, and they've also all said the exact same thing about, you know, the capital gains tax discount and certain negative gearing aspects and investment in public housing and things like that. And the government has taken up precisely zero of those recommendations, even though they're the answers, and they're just by how many, you know, times they're repeated in those inquiries, we know that they're correct. And yeah, instead, you know, the government solution is to let's give property developers more money. Let's make, you know, let's any solution that they want to propose, whether it's the coalition or it's like Labor, they're like, we're gonna give a solution that increases the price of housing. And that's not correct. That's like, it's already too expensive. That's the problem here. That's the problem we're trying to address. So yeah, I don't know, it's just really frustrating. And then in the meantime, people can't afford to rent, and homelessness increases in Australia. While we have all these solutions already on the table, and they're being presented to people who own investment properties to vote on solutions about their investment properties, that they're like, nah, I don't like this very much. So, we're just going to wait and see what happens, see what the market does and whatever, while people are dying and, you know, renters die from landlords not being screwed to put in a smoke alarm, for example. I've been reading a bunch of coroner's reports about, you know, the real estate agent was like, yeah, there's a smoke alarm, when in reality there was no smoke alarm, and then there was a fire and the renter died. And yeah, stuff like that happens so often, and it's just, I don't know, it makes me really angry, and it's going to get a lot worse before anything happens. So yeah, awesome stuff.
Before, Matt, I'll come again to you about some of the taxation stuff in a second, but Geordie, if I can stay with you and the work that you've been doing around how many vacant homes are around Australia. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so like we've just got a lot of empty and abandoned houses in Australia. So I've been posting the addresses of some of those houses for people to squat in if you want. Because like if you're rich enough to have a property, an investment property lying around that you don't need, then I feel like someone else can use that. Like we shouldn't have homes without people while we have people without homes. That is a ridiculous notion to me. It's also legal in Australia, and it's also how we founded this country by stealing a bunch of land from Indigenous people. So, like, let's do it back to the rich people. It's like this is not a new concept by any stretch of the imagination. It is part of our culture. So yeah, I feel like do it to rich people. Um, Let the people have some land back, and yeah, I like it. I don't know. A lot of people are angry about it. And maybe if you're angry about it, then don't leave a house abandoned for 15 years.
And you say a lot of people get angry about it. I've seen some of the media interviews that you've done on this, and there is some palpable anger out there from people, but it is just kind of pretty hard to, like, when you talk about the fact that these are people with no roof over their head at
Mm.
all, it's pretty hard to argue against.
No, yeah, exactly. It's kind of there's two kind of aspects to it. There's this notion that there's a bunch of people who are aspirational landlords in Australia, and I think it's a culture that we need to fight against. But yeah, these people are willing to kind of step in and protect the honor of some random that they don't know, who's hoarding a house and not letting anyone live there and kind of creating this tension. Like, why should you can't do that to someone else's house? It's like they don't even have often like most circumstances, they don't even have an investment property, let alone a vacant investment property. So I will never understand that. I'll never understand defending the honor of some random rich person you've never met. But then there's the other aspect of, the people, like when we talk on particularly these panels and we talk to government, we're talking to landlords, generally speaking, and they simply do not understand that, you know, people would like a roof over their heads. So when I spoke on the project, I had a bunch of things I wanted to talk about. I wanted to talk about, how you can just connect the electricity back if you want to. Like electricity providers don't care who's paying the bills as long as someone is paying the bills. They don't care whether you're the landlord or a tenant or a squatter. But yeah, like I wanted to talk about some tips, and then I realized that the conversation was getting to like, oh, is it better to actually live inside than it is outside? And it's like I can't believe we're at this point in Australia where we have such a big disconnect between the rich and then the rest of us that we have to talk about whether or not you'd like to live inside. Like, yeah, I don't know, it's nuts.
Pretty disheartening, and particularly as you and May have been talking about, like the actual problem of homelessness being so difficult. And May, at the moment, I think there's so many people who are in homelessness who have never appeared experiencing homelessness before. Certainly, I know after we've had a lot of natural disasters across Australia, there have been a lot of families whose house burnt down or was flooded, living in tents for months and years after those kinds of things. But it's impacting people who've been, as we said, pushed out of the rental market and other things as well. Matt, I want to come back to you. You were talking about negative gearing and capital gains tax and benefits from that, I think. But also, what are the other measures that government can do that we know actually make things better and not make things worse?
Yeah, like I said, if you got rid of all the tax concessions, which basically are the benefits that go to investors, that encourage investors into the market, you'd reduce investor demand for housing. So what would happen? Well, less people would show up to house auctions, less investors would show up to house auctions, which means the price wouldn't go as high, which means you would have more homeowners. So if you took out these investor incentives, you wouldn't decrease the number of housing. There's no investor out there that goes, well, because I'm not, getting my tax concession anymore, I'm going to burn my house down so nobody can have it. No, what they'll do is they'll sell the house and they'll sell it to people who actually want to live in it. And so we'll see home ownership rates up. And the other thing that's really important to know is that, look, if a lot of people rushed in and invested in the stock market, right, in the share market, then look, shares might go through a bubble that they might get overvalued. Right. Whereas if a lot of people rush into invest in housing, then house prices go up. All right. And that has impacts. That pushes people into poverty, that pushes people into homelessness. So if you're somebody out there who's thinking about what you want to invest in, there are plenty of options of things you can invest in, and maybe housing isn't the thing you should be investing in.
And Matt, the government does invest in public housing, not as much as it used to, but there's other mechanisms that we already use. I'm thinking here of the fact that we build and buy housing for Defence Force personnel. There's not just this model of investing in houses. We actually do purchase them and build them, do we not?
Yeah, absolutely. So, the house, as part of your package in the Defence Forces, working for the Defence Force, they will supply you with housing. So, if the government were to crack down on these tax concessions, as I said, they're worth about $20 billion a year. That would build a lot of housing. We could build housing for nurses. We could build housing for teachers. We could build housing for people. And we could build them in the places where people have jobs, where they want to live, in the communities they want to stay in. Public housing isn't just for really poor people. Even if you will never qualify for public housing adds to the stock of housing, and it reduces the demand for, when it's not there, then more people are demanding those rental properties. And so if you've got people going into public housing rather than the private rental market, then you're reducing the increase in rents. So it helps everybody. Except for investors, by the way, because it will stop house prices going up as much as they're currently going up. They're the only losers. That's sort of 15% of taxpayers who currently invest in housing.
And I did just want to ask about those interactions, I guess, because we hear a lot of politicians talk about wanting to make housing more affordable, but they never really mean making housing cheaper.
Yep.
But you and I have these discussions all the time in the office. Like, a lot of people who invest in housing, they're looking for a capital gain down the track. And people who own their own house are often looking at their house prices going up and thinking, wow, that's great. But what they don't understand necessarily is, if house prices keep going up, if they ever want to sell their house, then they have to buy in at that new higher level of house price. I mean, for people who do own their own homes, why does affordable housing and making housing cheaper for people to access make sense for people who own their own homes as well?
Yeah, look, absolutely. So, if house prices go up and you just own the home you live in, that doesn't really benefit you at all. Why doesn't it benefit? Because if you ever sell your house, you might get more for it, as you say, but you've then got to live somewhere. So you've got to buy another house. And that's going to be more expensive. If house prices go down or become more affordable, sure, you won't get as much for your house when you sell it and want to move, but also it'll cost you less to buy the next house that you buy that you live in. So really, it is only people who own houses, investment properties, houses that they don't live in. These are the people who gain from constantly increasing house prices. And the problem with constantly increasing house prices is people see the price constantly going up and they think, wow, that's a great place to get in. I want to invest in that. And so they rush in, which further increases house prices. And this is where this capital gains tax discount and negative gearing, these tax concessions, are encouraging more investors into the market, pushing prices ever higher in order to make bigger and bigger returns. And we've gotten away from the idea that what is a house for? A house is an investment good. It shouldn't be, its primary purpose shouldn't be as an investment good. It should be a place where you raise a family, where you live, where you have security. It shouldn't be about, building a nest egg for the future.
I'm going to go to questions from the audience now. I can see we've got about 560 people on the line with us and about 70 questions. I'm really sorry, we aren't going to get through all of those questions. So it would be super helpful if you can spot a really great question that you would like me to put to the panel. You can upvote people's questions. That would be super helpful for me if you don't mind. Thank you, audience, for joining us. So the first question that I've got is from Colin Roberts, and he says, do you think it's time to ditch the neoliberal idea that a house is an investment? Like a motor car, should they actually depreciate to only the value of the allotment? And then a new updated house could be built on the site at some point in the future. Matt, I might give you that one first, and then May, if you want to respond as well.
Yeah, look, absolutely. As I just said, a house is, as you know, the others have said, a house is a human right, and it's not a human right because it's an investment good. It's a human right because it is so vital for life, and we really need to focus in on that. And that's before we kind of. Before about 2000, when the capital gains tax discount came in, that's what housing was. And renting, there were some rental properties. You know, renting is useful. A small stock of rental property is useful. But primarily, housing is about security and not investment. And we need to flip back to that idea that you know, housing is something that people aspire to. They want to own their own home so they can live in it, not own lots and lots of houses so they can make lots of money from it. There are lots of ways you can invest. I'm not against investment as an economist, but you know, there are better and worse investments, and housing is, in Australia, has become over-invested in, and we need to return back to the idea that housing is a consumer good.
May, did you want to respond to that as well?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. We need to move away from the idea that housing is like a, you know, an asset, an investment, what have you. But I think we need to, the other side of that coin is that we need to return to the idea that it's the government's responsibility to ensure that everybody's got a home. I think, you know, one of the kind of linguistic, you know, changes I've seen over the past kind of 10 years or so is the way homelessness and housing affordability is sort of spoken about like it's a weather system, you know, it's this thing that the government has no control over. It's just something that happens to people, but it's something that government does, right? Government is in control of how affordable housing is. Government is in control of whether every citizen has a home. They used to play a really big role in providing homes. And if we had a major crisis in some kind of area of society, like if we had a huge health crisis or a huge education crisis, we wouldn't be saying that the solution is to bring in a bunch of investors, you know, private investors. We'd be, you know, really demanding that the government steps in, takes some action. I also think, like, I don't always love the framing of investors. I think it is really important that people who are landlords see themselves as suppliers of an essential service. And where we get this kind of pushback, like about, oh, well, I can't afford to do this kind of upgrade, or I can't afford to limit rent increases, or, you know, people feeling entitled to whatever tax handout is being given to them as a landlord. The onus really does need to be turned around back onto people, that you are the supplier of an essential service. And if you can't do that well, you need to think about whether you're the right person to supply housing to another person. You know, I think that's extremely reasonable. Yeah. Yeah.
Jordan, is there anything you would like to add to that?
Yeah, sure. I've got a bit of a different perspective to the commenter's question. So Colin said, you know, should we ditch a neoliberal idea that the housing is an investment? And yes, absolutely. But that it should ultimately like depreciate to zero. I disagree with that. And this is a bit of a Georgist perspective, and I'm not a Georgist by any means. But like when you purchase a house, when you purchase land, you take away society's access to that land. And particularly in Australia, where this land was never ours, to take away that access to the land. But when you buy land, you take away everyone else's access to that land, and you privatize the land. And then society and the state and the government or whoever it is increases the value of that land, whether that's through adding infrastructure like roads and hospitals nearby, or it's people who, open a cafe or, add culture to your area, to your suburb, and like whether or not that ends up gentrifying it or whatever, the value of your land is going to increase through the contributions of people that are not you. Like you can do nothing. You can literally, as I've been demonstrating, sit on your land, let it decay, let it rot, and the value of your land will increase from the $10,000 that you bought it in 1980 to $1.74 million today through nothing. You've done nothing. You may have put temporary fencing around it. And I think our tax system needs to adequately tax people to kind of re-socialize the value of that increase in property. If you've done nothing to increase the property, the people that did the work increasing the value of that property deserve kind of some recognition and some kind of tax incentive for increasing the value of your property that you've privatized. And that is a George's perspective, but it's also my perspective if we can't, just take the land back and socialize it in other ways.
Thank you, Geordie. The next question is from Lana Hasili, who says, how are we meant to respond to politicians who say that they are working hard to fix housing whilst there's been zero action on tackling the failed policies that make it easier for Australians to buy their second, fifth or 10th property rather than their first? Matt, if I can come to you first, that again, I think comes back to that idea that I was talking about, where politicians all the time talk about that they care about housing affordability, but they never really say if they want housing prices to go up or down, for example, just always more affordable, quite vague. Yeah, how are we meant to respond to politicians who are working hard on that issue? What are some of the things we could call them to account on?
Yeah, look, absolutely. It's the policies they put forward. So both sides of government have a big, long laundry list of policies that will either make absolutely no impact on making housing more affordable or will make housing less affordable. And they bundle them all in and call them housing affordability. And when a journalist asks a question, they recite off this laundry list of policies that, on the idea that, well, I'm doing something. And that's how you need to call them to account. The policies that they put forward need to be policies that will actually work. And at the moment, they are not policies that work. They are policies that they can list in a press conference. As housing ownership rates actually fall, what we're actually seeing is a larger and larger amount of the voting public are actually not interested in seeing house prices continue to rise. And an increasing number of people who do own their own home, but also have kids and grandkids and are concerned for other people, are also unhappy that house prices are continuing to rise. So I think that there is a shift on. I think that it's not happening fast enough, unfortunately, and it needs to happen more quickly. But politicians at the moment, I don't know whether they really are, as you say, that concerned or wanting to solve the problem of housing affordability, because it means that house prices either have to come down or at least that house prices need to increase slower than incomes increase. If incomes are rising faster than house prices, then housing is becoming more affordable. If they're not, it's becoming less affordable. And at the moment, it continues to become less affordable.
Maiy, did you want to say anything about that?
Yeah, I want to add to that. I think it's about more than just governments not wanting the cost of housing to go down. They don't want to be truly responsible for housing, right? I mean, I think this is a really big part of it. It's why you're hearing more and more rhetoric about supply. Australia has actually never had more housing supply. We've never had more homes per person than we have now, but housing has never been less fairly distributed in Australia because the government has walked away from its responsibility to supply housing and keep, provide homes that people can actually afford and provide conditions, in the private market for homes that people can afford. We did a report over summer called Grudnoff, and it was about it was about this change in Australian housing, you know, who supplies it and how the government kind of prioritises it. Right now, they spend 5 times as much propping up private rental as they do providing housing themselves. That's through the tax system. It's also through measures like Commonwealth rent assistance. All of these things are linked to the government stepping back from supplying housing itself. If we want to know what the government could be doing, exactly like Matt says, it's not this huge laundry list of things. I know that there are a few think tanks out there that think that, not the Australia Institute, but there are a couple of out there who use these really baffling analogies about like knitting a quilt or, you know, putting a puzzle together or whatever. That's not how we fix housing. It's not going to be 70 small things. What we need to see the government do is step up and start providing homes themselves. And when you look around the world at countries that have either managed to truly tackle their housing crises, this is a global problem, or the countries that have managed to avoid them altogether, they are countries where the government is a big provider of housing. In Australia, not only are they not that, but they are doing things that actively prop up and kind of inflame the cost of housing in the private sector.
Mm.
Yeah, and just to back May up with a figure, right? How do we know that it's not just the supply of housing, that it is this kind of investment side? Well, over the last 10 years, the population has increased by 15%. So in order just to keep up, you would imagine you'd need an extra 15% more houses. But over the last 10 years, the number of houses has increased by 19%. So it's actually increased by more than the population. So obviously more housing is going to help make housing more affordable, but clearly there are other factors involved here. It is not just a lack of supply.
The next question is from John Nev, who asks, how do you discourage greed when it's so well rewarded? That's a big question, John.
Stop rewarding it. Yeah. I mean, yeah, I think I find this like really baffling. The countries that have affordable housing, they still have rich people, right? I mean, people just invest in other things. I think it's not like Australians have this like genetic predisposition or this mania for investing in housing. Investors have followed the incentives that have been created by government. And if those incentives went away, people with money will put their money into other things. I really don't think it's, you know, I don't think we need to end greed. I think we just need to fix housing, you know.
And like most things in public policy, including climate change and other things, like they're big problems, but with very straightforward policy responses that we know about that can fix it.
Yeah, that unfortunately will impact negatively in the short term rich people, which is why we don't see that change. We need a government to grasp the nettle and say, look, you know, this is in the best interests of Australia to do this, and I'm going to piss a few people off in order to do it.
I've got a question from Luciano Fafaro, who talks about any European country of comparable economic wealth to Australia has a portion of social housing to total housing varying from roughly 25 to 40%. Sorry, this is a very long question. How can homelessness hoping to be solved or ended in Australia with only 3 to 4%? Yeah, I think we have talked about this a lot and the problems with the private market. Luciano is also talking about things like zoning and tax reforms and other bits and pieces in there. May, how do other countries do it better?
Yeah, so there's a range of different models. Like I said, the thing they all have in common is that government is a big provider of housing. So you've got on the spectrum, like the Singapore model, where the government builds homes and sells them at cost price, basically, heavily subsidized to people who own, to people who want to buy, I should say. And there's a lot of limitations on the resale. So you're not selling it to make a profit if you bought it from the government, but basically it just guarantees everybody you know, a secure home to live in. On the flip side, there's places like, you know, Austria, which has a huge supply of social housing. It's 60% social housing, much more a culture of renting than owning. You know, Singapore, the emphasis is on the government building so that people can buy. But You know, France has, you know, 50% social housing. When you look at the countries that are trying to turn it around, they're doing more than just like making it possible for the private sector to build more homes. There's a lot of derp science about this. I know that you guys have done some events with Cameron Murray, you know, about some of the myths surrounding the housing supply. But in London, for example, which has some of the most unaffordable housing in the world, that is trying to turn it around quickly. They've got some really ambitious targets around inclusionary zoning, which basically just means forcing the private sector to return more homes to the public. So, you know, there aren't really requirements for inclusionary zoning in Australia. The City of Sydney has a target of like 1%, which is nothing. You know, in places like London and Paris, 30%, 40%, 50% of all new developments are being required to be, you know, social housing. And that's the kind of thing we need to start seeing if we're going to make a big impact on affordability.
Jordan, I wondered if I could come to you next. We've had a couple of people in the questions and comments kind of talking about the response from politicians and, you know, not just what can be done, but also the fact that many politicians themselves are investors. This is obviously a really potent electoral issue, not just for renters, but for a much wider proportion of people in the country than that. Just in terms of the feedback that you get from people that use ship rentals and the other work that you do as an advocate in this space, how big of an election issue do you think this will be? And do you think that will encourage, I guess, the parties to kind of take a bit of a different tack if they see some electoral consequences?
Yeah, I think so. We know from the last census that, you know, 31% of Australia are renters, and that number is just growing. But we also know that historically renters haven't particularly voted as a renting block of voters kind of thing. And historically, you know, it's a lot harder to organize renters than it is to organize people in a workplace because, you know, we've got no workplace. We all live in our little homes and stuff like that, separately from everyone. So, I know it is going to be a big issue at this election. I don't know that it's going to be, just based on a bunch of promises that have been made. If we go on those promises that have been made, the issue is going to get far worse, if this is allowed. So I don't think, you know, it's going to have much of an impact. But I think the next election, the one after this, when people are really, you know, a lot of people have unfortunately died due to these decisions. And a lot of people are really feeling the pinch, particularly even rich people. When it starts to really affect rich people, that's when we'll see results, which is unfortunate, unless we organize and start targeting, you know, politicians who are landlords in marginal seats and make them lose their jobs. I don't know if anything's going to really happen, unless, you know, we can do stuff, like the people can organize and we can do stuff in the absence of the government. And that is, you know, we're starting to see hints of that. But yeah, I've got a really pessimistic outlook for this election unless, yeah, some landlords lose their jobs, really.
Maiy, did you want to respond to that as well? Just in terms of like we're heading towards a federal election, state elections happen all the time. This is a bigger and bigger issue, but they're still not fixing it.
Yeah, this is something I get asked about all the time because a lot of opinion polls show that there is really strong support for tax reform, right? The Essential have done 3 polls in the last year, all showing quite a bit of support for tax reform. The Everybody's Home campaign did a poll with Redbridge earlier this year showing that 3 out of 5 people support winding back these tax handouts. And only 1 in 5 people oppose. And social housing, I mean, we don't even need to talk about it. It is incredibly popular. People want to see the government put more money into delivering housing themselves. The issue that we've got in Australia is that this debate is really driven by a small number of people with a lot of political power, and we need to build the political power and build a political constituency among people who actually want to live in housing, not just people who want to invest in it. I've been keeping kind of a vague eye on the chat, and a few people have mentioned the 2019 election. A lot of people don't talk about the 2016 election. Labor went to the 2016 election promising to wind back CGT and negative gearing tax concessions, and they won 14 seats. A lot of things were going on in 2019. I don't think we should be inferring that this isn't something that would be widely supported. It's just going to be something that's really painful for a few people with a lot of political power. And the answer to that is for us to build political power among people who want to live in homes.
Matt, the next question I've got is from Roger Tonkin, who says negative gearing and the capital gains tax concessions were supposed to provide incentives for investment in housing. And why has that not worked? So if you could explain why that mechanism combined has made the problem worse rather than better.
Yeah, because the vast majority of investors who benefit from negative gearing and the capital gains tax discounts, about 90%, aren't buying new houses; they're buying existing houses. So all it's done is bid up the price of new existing housing stock. If you wanted to keep the capital gains tax discount and negative gearing, then what you could do is you could say, well, it only applies if you build a new home, if you add to the housing stock, if it encourages more houses to be built. But there is no economic justification, none, zero, naught, for to give these kind of concessions to people who are just buying, who are just outbidding owner occupiers. That is, people who are just buying the existing stock. There's no economic benefit to that, and it's just making housing less affordable.
We've got to wrap up very shortly. I want to thank everyone for participating today. I'm really sorry we can't get to all your questions, but just a reminder for people who are interested and engaged. Maiy, can you please tell them where they can find out about the People's Commission again, one more time, please?
everybody'shome.com.au, and you can email if you want to share your experience with us as part of the commission, info@everybody'shome.com.au. We'd love to get as many stories as possible, even though they're kind of harrowing to read.
Thanks very much. And Geordie, where can people find out what you are up to?
Shitrentals.org, and then like TikTok and Instagram and stuff like that.
And there's always new content going up and new things to check out. So do make sure you head on over to those places to get engaged in this issue. And for all the Australia Institute's research, including a lot of papers that Matt has written on capital gains tax discount and why it's shit, you can head on over to australiainstitute.org.au. I want to thank Jordan, Maiy, and Matt for the panel today, and everyone who joined us and put forward such thoughtful questions. I'm really sorry, as always, we can't get to all of them, but I feel like we covered a lot of ground today. And thanks very much, everyone, for your interest. Thank you again to our panel. Don't forget, you can head on over to australiainstitute.org.au to find all our upcoming webinars. Richard Dennis at the moment is on a national tour called Unequal Australia. He's visiting a lot of capital cities and some regional cities. So head on over to our website to find out where you can go and see Richard Dennis talking about how to make Australia more equal and tackle inequality properly. If you're in Canberra tomorrow night, we're doing Politics in the Pub with Zoe Daniel and Emma Shortis. That is about the US election and our relationship with America. That's Zoe Daniel, the independent MP for Goldstein. And next week, our unparliamentary webinar, that's our fortnightly webinar on federal politics, will be with Karen Middleton from Guardian Australia. That'll be at 1 p.m. Next Tuesday. So don't forget to tune into that. And we've got podcasts, Follow the Money and Dollars and Cents. Follow the Money, where we explain politics, economics, and in plain English, and Dollars and Cents is always about what's happening in the economy. You can find those wherever you normally listen to podcasts. Thank you so much for your time today, everyone. We'll talk to you again soon. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoy our videos, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell button to get notified when we publish a new one. See you next time.